G'day everyone, my name is Chris Menage and I am the founder of E Squared Educational Ecosystems. And today we are getting together to talk about learning about meaning, not things, with a particular emphasis on agency as the catalyst or certainly the genesis for change in systems design. So a quick overview, we'll start at the beginning with the context before we jump into Simon Sinek's golden circle framework of the why, the how, and the what of agency and systems design. Now, context is king, as we know. So let's see what 2020 brought us. I'm just going to pause the video and focus only on the PowerPoint. So, this year has been an unparalleled year. We've talked about pivot, the need to pivot. We've talked about how it's been unprecedented, and certainly it has been. But, unusual times call for new ways of thinking. And with every challenge comes new opportunities. So although 2020 has been difficult, I would really encourage us to use this year as an opportunity to reconsider, to rethink, and perhaps reset the way that we go about business as usual. Now, how does this apply to education? Well, you've got to love a story, and Eric Carles's classic is arguably one of the best. Now, as we know, this is a story of a greedy little caterpillar, one that gets itself into a bit of strife, just eating a little bit too much. Now, people far more clever than me have drawn parallels about the plight of this caterpillar and our society more generally. Now, this is particularly true in the context of wicked problems such as COVID-19. What did COVID-19 tell us about ourselves as a community, as a society? My thoughts is that this story is a pretty apt illustration of the bind that we find ourselves in at the moment. Why do I say that? Well, because if you look at the way that some of us behaved during COVID-19, we will remember that some pleasantries were stripped back to reveal certain stark realities. Things like toilet paper, the bare necessities of life, couldn't be guaranteed in the early stages of the pandemic, if we remember back in March. When people started hoarding, or even fighting for toilet paper in shopping centre aisles. A fairly sad example of people's wherewithal and ability to adapt to fear and uncertainty, which are now part and parcel of our world. Which leads me back to Eric Carles's book of the caterpillar and this notion of chrysalis, or basically this transitional state. COVID brought out the best in many of us, not just the worst. Many communities saw a resurgence in connectivity. We saw local movements such as the Rainbow Trail with the colouring in with chalk. We had the Great Bear Hunt. We had street newspapers being created, food being passed over fences. And generally, there seemed to be this greater sense of connectedness. So it's quite the change from the high suburban walls and the disconnected families that we've become used to in our frenetic lifestyles prior to COVID. So this brings me back to the caterpillar, which undergoes a metamorphosis or a process of transformation. In Eric Carles's book, the premise is that despite its ill-gotten gains from excessive consumption, the caterpillar is able to transform into a beautiful butterfly via the protective confines of its cocoon. It's important for us to remember that metamorphosis is messy, it's gooey, it's yuck. It's the shedding of an outer layer so an inner layer may be revealed. So I imagine it's painful, it's unpleasant, but it's necessary if that caterpillar is to fulfill its potential through transformation. And just so, I would argue that it's necessary for students to be challenged, for educators to be challenged, for them to be uncomfortable and to put into these situations of discomfort, and for us to learn to adapt to these situations so that we too can transform from the experience. I believe that the OECD have a similar notion given the release of the transformative competencies for 2030. Much like the caterpillar's ability to survive and thrive its journey from an earthbound slug to a free-flying insect, our students need to do the same. They need to adopt hard shells while protecting a soft inside as they prepare to transform and fly afar. The question is, are we providing them with the opportunities to do so? And that brings us to the why of education. Now, in my opinion, the why of education is around this notion of mastery and learning, as a persistent cycle of pragmatic learning, experimental adaptation, constantly revising, to be a human being, not a human doer. So I would encourage us to use 2020, our collective annus horribilis, as an opportunity to transform, to transition into something better, perhaps the great reset, as has been mentioned. Because if we think of education, if we change tact a little bit and we see it from a different perspective, if we think of a patient who's sick and suffers from the symptoms of a disease, we try and give that patient medicine to cure the disease, but the patient has already suffered. I would argue, what if the patient doesn't need to suffer? Wouldn't we prefer to avoid any medication by ensuring that we don't get sick in the first place? And my hope is that education can achieve this. If we educate for meaning, if we educate for experience, if we educate for the notion of being immersed in the human experience, we can transform lives, we can transform communities. Education can be a powerful preventative measure. It can allay fears and bridge gaps. At its core, it's about instilling common foundations, shared experiences, empathy, which all detract from polarization and anarchy, particularly some of the examples that we've seen around the world at the moment, the division, the disengagement, the disenfranchisement. Which brings me back to education and its why. For me, education, its purpose is to build social capital. And this is important because social capital is the lubricant that keeps our societies moving freely and harmoniously. Progressive societies rely on the education system to build this social capital. The model that I've used to express this is confluence squared. And what I attempt to show in this model is how, I'm just going to try and annotate this, is how, if we start with this notion of connectivity and interdependence, and if we encourage people to have the opportunities to interact with each other, to collaborate together, and to really learn through that interaction, I would argue that all of that then shapes and informs our collective wisdom and our collective experience. And in fact, the more that you do that, the more that you create momentum, and that momentum then flows on, it's amplified into shaping and designing educational models and systems. So here we can see how the agency of one or of a few, the more that they collaborate and that they're interconnected, the more that this informs a collective knowledge or pool of expertise, which in itself then amplifies the design of the system. Now I'm just going to clear all this and we'll go back to the PowerPoint. So how can we do this? How can this be achieved? Well, I think like everything, a good place to start is with a little video.
E2's vision for education is simple, yet deceptively complex. Intentionally so. It reflects a world that, while beautiful, is itself also complex, volatile, and ambiguous. And that won't change.
Education is learning to navigate change and the stages of purposeful lives. Change is the only thing that is certain.
E squared believes education is infinitely greater than any curriculum, so education needs to embrace change.
To work with complexity, not against it, because education, like life, is relational and magical.
E squared, connecting catalysts,
creating change.
I hope you enjoyed the voices of my children in that. That was their little challenge to get uncomfortable and become comfortable in discomfort. So how does this relate to education and what do we need to do? Well, what I believe we need to do is we need to create these mindsets and dispositions as windows to the world. With the right mindsets, with the right attitudes and dispositions for the 21st century, we can empower people to be adaptive, to be resilient, to have lateral thinking, and to adopt these worldviews that embrace connectivity and the notion of exchange and collaboration as the genesis for innovation and progress. So in my opinion, we don't need more instructions and we don't need more policies, procedures, and certainly not maps. But what we do need is we need agreed general principles, broad protocols that value and catalyze lived experience and wisdom to be passed down. How might this work? Well, I've grappled with this, and what I've come up with is this model of emergent squared. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to combine Bloom's and Maslow's dichotomies, that they're models, into this DNA helix. So what the DNA helix shows is that there's a relationship between what we learn and how we learn. Now, if educational systems recognize this and prioritize both equally, then we have a chance to sort of promote or push students up the DNA helix towards this notion of self-actualization and creativity. The higher a learner goes, the more their worldview expands. I'm just going to bring this up again. So just imagine as a learner is exposed to more and more experiences, and as they're challenged, as they go through, these are zones of transition here. And there's lots of different types of zones. There's the liminal space, there's the zone of disequilibrium. And it's often in these zones that we actually learn the most about ourselves and about life and the world. And if we embrace this as part of our educational process and we but if we encourage people to evolve into these emerging paradigms where things are less linear, less quantitative and factual, but far more flexible and nuanced, then they have a greater chance of being able to adapt and to thrive in the 21st century. Now, I've got a lot more information that goes behind this model, and I'd really encourage everyone to reach out to me if you would like access to that research. So what can we do here with education in practice? Well, here's a little example that I think illustrates it pretty well. I organised an initiative a couple of months ago, a collaboration, which for me really accentuated this notion of unleashing the elephant in the room. Now, for me, the elephant in the room is agency, which brings us back to the theme of this talk, because agency is a way of amplifying that collective wisdom that I referred to before in the confluence model. And what I did was I organised for 14 educators to get together, and I intentionally kept the outcomes as broad and non-specific as possible because I just wanted to set the ethos or the protocols for the interaction. I didn't want to determine what outcome I was looking for. And what everyone had to do was to bring one case study of a program that they had implemented in real life, and that they had found had really impacted on their students and resulted in some amazing outcomes. And then we discussed all of them. So they only had 4 minutes or so to give the overview of their program, and then we unpacked each one. And what we found, and this was no real surprise in hindsight, but the common thread theme that came through all of these was that agency had been an essential ingredient in their programs. It was their passion and their ability to find the opportunity to implement that passion that really ignited the students' passion and then obviously amplified their outcomes. Once again, I'd encourage you to click on this link and follow it, or reach out to me for the research behind this and the outcomes that were submitted to UNESCO. The outcomes were summarized as 3 levels of agency: the micro, the collective, the meso, and the systems level, the macro. And we felt that if agency was embedded in all 3 levels, then an adaptive systems design was possible. And so educational systems could be adaptive and far more responsive to student needs. And I don't think we'd have the student disengagement levels that we have at the moment, or the teacher attrition levels that we have at the moment, if our systems were truly adaptive. This brings us back to this notion of creativity. And here I'd like to just quote Leonardo da Vinci, as you do, when he said, "I have no special talents. I'm just passionately curious." If you remember just before I talked about mindsets, and if we relate that to da Vinci's notion that, I have no special talents, I'm just passionately curious, accepting that, his learning and his discoveries were going to be imperfect, enabled da Vinci to achieve remarkable things. 2 sort of models of his that really stand out in my mind are the Vitruvian Man and the self-supporting bridge, which embody this notion of innovation and what is possible when creativity and generative thought are truly unleashed. Our mission, I believe, as educators then should be on lifting our gazes to the horizon, on broadening minds to push those students up the helix, so that they too see the possibilities and the opportunities instead of the processes and the policies. Accountability has a role, there's a place for it, but agency needs to be encouraged, not constrained. Schools, in my view, are microcosms of societies that they serve, and so instead of looking outwards, we need to sometimes look inwards into ourselves and into our own school communities to try and find these solutions. Imagine what might be achieved if we truly unshackled the innovation and collaboration, and if we gave time and space for the teachers, the students, the learners, the parents to exercise their agency more, to do and not to try, as Yoda says. We need to be comfortable with the notion that the answer doesn't lie in somebody else's responsibility by blaming somebody else or looking for somebody else to ease the burden for us, but that the answer lies within us, that change comes in all shapes and sizes, often in response to a crisis just like this COVID-19 pandemic. The best ideas are all too often generated by those most affected by the problem, because necessity is the mother of all invention. We are the solution that we're looking for. So I'd like to leave us on this beautiful quote by Desmond Tutu, which I think really sums up what an educational experience needs to be about. It needs to be about promoting belonging and a sense of community, and an understanding that what we do impacts on others. So if we start from a place of empathy, then we can develop some of that social capital that progressive societies rely on so desperately. And so that's what we've talked about today. We've started with the context of COVID-19. What did that reveal to us about ourselves? We've looked at the why of education, or at least my perspective of what the why of education is, what can be done, and how that can be done. So I'd like to thank you very much for, I'll just turn my video back on to have a bit more of a personal a personal goodbye. I'd like to thank everyone for paying attention, and hopefully there are people paying attention. And I'd really encourage you to please reach out to me. Looking to connect with everyone, as the tagline says. I believe that together we achieve more, and that we truly are better together. So thank you for listening, and look forward to hopefully coming across you soon.